Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast, Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. Our guest on this episode is Will Jawando. Will is a council member at Montgomery County Council in the state of Maryland. He was a candidate for Congress and served as Associate Director of Public Engagement in the White House during the Obama administration, which is where we met. He has a law degree from the Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of America. And today we're going to talk a little bit about his proposed legislation to remove police from public high school campuses, among other things. Will, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Don. Thanks for having me. And it's really good to be reconnected after such a long time. So thanks for reaching out.
It's good to see you and to talk to you. This podcast is Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves, and we see life as a journey. And so I'd like to begin by asking you how you got started on the journey of public service and in particularly your career in the law.
Sure. Well, I didn't know I was going to be involved in public service or the law in any way. My mother used to always say, I had a little soapbox even as a little kid. I used to speak up for people. So I guess there were some signs of some sort of advocacy and activism, it really for me is a combination of growing up and being exposed to inequity and disparities in my neighborhood and my community. We were very low income. I'm the son of a Nigerian immigrant, and my mom is from a small farm town in Kansas. And they got together and moved here to Maryland, seeking economic opportunity, but also understanding of their interracial marriage. And they split when I was 6, and we were very low income before they split, and then even more so after, when it was just me and my mom. And so I grew up and saw, lived in substandard rental housing. At the same time, living in Montgomery County, which is one of the top, 15 to 20 wealthiest counties in the country. I also saw all the great development and access to amenities and other things that are here, but that didn't reach my neighborhood. So I was very aware just as a kid that, hey, what's going on here? There's some things that are happening here that are nice and not so nice in my neighborhood. And then that really culminated for me when I was a teenager. I unfortunately lost one of my best friends in an act of gun violence. He had gotten caught up in drugs and in the hanging out with the wrong folks and lost his life. And it really forced me at a young age to start examining what are the reasons behind why opportunity is so unequal for so many. And, I thought about the fact that, his mom worked 2 low wage paying jobs, one of which was cleaning houses in a wealthier part of the county. And so that meant she couldn't be home when he got out of school, because it took her 2.5 hours on the bus to get to work and back. And there wasn't an after school program to pick him up. And, he didn't have the supportive teachers that necessarily believed he could achieve. So I started to realize that there were systemic policy and budgetary reasons that led to our different outcomes. And that got me upset. Didn't know what I was going to do with all that energy, but I can really trace the last 20 plus years of my professional career to investigating those kind of systemic, educational, criminal justice, transportation, go down the list, budgetary inequities, and trying to improve those outcomes for more people. And so that's led me a lot of places, as you said, to the White House, working for Nancy Pelosi, working for Sherrod Brown in the Senate, and then now as an elected official myself. And it's just always been a big motivator. I want everyone to be able to achieve their potential and have access to opportunity, which is what we all want in America, but we know it's not been true for everybody. And we're constantly trying to perfect that.
Well, you mentioned education earlier and the disparities that you even saw in education, which of course leads me to my primary reason for having you on the program. I found out that you indeed were involved in proposing legislation there in Montgomery County to remove police from public high school campuses. So with all the past, school shootings and problems on high school campuses, which I think we've all witnessed, I, had a very sad, personal experience where one of my, favorite educators in junior high school, in fact, was a teacher who taught gardening and agronomy. And he was the reason that I'm still gardening today in my retirement.
Yeah.
And in later subsequent years, after about 10 years after I left, was out of middle school, he was stabbed on campus by a student. And I was, just absolutely devastated. And it was actually during that same period, I think it was in the state of Texas, that police started appearing on campuses. And now we're, caught up in this controversy of police violence, social and criminal injustices, and so now many people are looking for solutions. And one of your solutions is to perhaps remove police actually from public high school campuses. How did you come to that conclusion, and what do you hope to accomplish with this legislation?
Well, you have to understand the history of policing in this country and put it in context to understand why I think the police officers in schools aren't an appropriate function, and it's particularly not how it's operating now. The first police forces were formed in the South, as you know, Don, to round up escaped enslaved individuals. They were called slave patrols, and obviously the history of policing has gone through to be an instrument of busting unions and deny voting rights, and certainly it has a very precarious history that reflects the history of our nation. And I think certain communities, we know from the data, have just been disproportionately impacted by that history. And the relationship has been a fraught relationship, one where you have the duality of needing protection in certain communities because of lack of investment. Police are on the front lines of answering things that society has failed to address, like poverty, and crime and income inequality and the like, but also reflect the systemic and historic racism in the country. And so I think a school building is no different in that it's embodying those societal disparities. And so when you look at, for example, in our county, who's been arrested by school resource officers, half of our arrests are of Black children who only account for about 20% of the student population. And when you look at what the arrests are for, they're for things like, marijuana possession, fighting, disruption. Certainly there are some charges for weapon possession. Those are the smaller amounts. And I think it's not being doled out. Not I think, you can see in the data, it's not being doled out in a proportionate way. And then when you look at the outcomes of when students are arrested, who's offered diversion, what they're charged with, what the record ultimately ends up being, the rest of the criminal justice system plays out in a disproportionate way as well. And that's what's called the school to prison pipeline, where you create an entry point into the criminal justice system with, say, a fight or even marijuana possession in a state where marijuana is decriminalized. And you are creating another entry point into a system that's already disproportionately impacting those students. And I think, so there's some harm happening in that. That's a disproportionate level of harm. That's number one. So we need to be aware of that and remove that. The second is that there are things we aren't investing in. We're making a budgetary choice we spend $3 million a year to maintain the school resource officer program. At the same time, we have one of the worst nurse to student ratios in the region. We don't have a social worker in every school. We don't have enough psychologists and counselors. And I think the reason when we introduced this bill, I also at the same day introduced 3 special appropriations, investing in mental health resources, restorative justice practices, training for school staff, to show that there's a better way to use these resources. And this is not to say that police officers are bad and they don't care about kids. I know many of our school resource officers that do care about our children and are trying their best. It's really what is the best tool and resource allocation and use of those dollars to support students holistically. And I think police are not the right tool. I think there are trained professionals who are in a better position to support student needs. And in a research-based way, we know that if you invest in nursing, counseling, restorative justice, those things lessen the likelihood of school violence and of harm. And then the final thing I'll say on the school shootings and other violence that has precipitated a lot of the growth of school resource officers. There are other, I think, better ways to secure buildings. Obviously, we want police to be able to respond quickly and efficiently if there is a mass shooting threat. But, the Washington Post did an analysis of 200 school shootings around the country, and only 2 incidences where the school resource officer able to intervene. There were actually more incidents of other school staff actually intervening. And so I don't think there's a lot of research to back up that actually does keep people safe in the building or reduce a mass shooting. We know that things like physical security of the building, classrooms that can lock automatically, having vestibules where people can't enter the building directly. There are other investments which we've made that training for the staff and students are things that can actually reduce the likelihood of those types of mass shooting events as well.
Right. So, but not everyone agrees that police should be removed from high school campuses. As you know, some of your fellow council members are certainly ambivalent on the issue. And they cite the fact that police on campuses have evolved, of course, to resource officers, often serving as deterrent to problems on campuses. Some of them are well trained. They act as counselors. They educate students on various aspects of the law. And some have been, of course, involved in stopping problems before they get started. So what do you say to your critics? How do you convince your fellow council members when they cite, some real statistics and evidence that resource officers have played a positive role on campuses?
Well, one thing I'll say is there actually aren't any statistics. A lot of the things you mentioned are anecdotal, and anecdotal evidence is certainly a part of the story and personal experiences. The only real statistics we have are the disproportionality in the arrests. And everything else has kind of been, this officer did this in this specific situation. And I think that should be shared. But no one has been able to answer to me how we address the disproportionate harm in the form of arrest, because proximity matters. If you talk to the principals and administrators, if Officer X is at the end of the hallway when a fight starts and they're able to come there and someone ends up getting arrested, the fact that they were that close, it matters. That might not have happened, or they might not have needed to have been called because they wouldn't have been there. Now, some situations are still going to lead in police interaction no matter what. Police, and we should make sure any officer that enters the building in a law enforcement capacity is trained properly, knows how to deal with young people and students. And I think that's a good goal. And we want our police to have a good relationship with the administrators and be able to know what's going on and speak to the security guards. And I'm not saying there can't be programmatic activities where they're coming in to do assemblies and playing basketball in the afternoons, or programmatic activities with the students. I think they should not be in the school in a law enforcement capacity stationed at the school. I think schools should be safe places of learning, where that's the focus. And when you talk to students, we had a survey done a couple of years ago. 80% of the students said they didn't want school resource officers in the building. And I think that we need to take into account. That was prior to the year we had this year with George Floyd and the social justice and the calls for police reform that have been amplified in a very difficult year in the protests across the world. And I think the mental health of the students who see an officer that don't necessarily want to see an officer in school, that's something we need to factor in as well. And so it's not about an individual officer or did they have a good relationship with a student and did they help in a situation? Of course they did. I think it's asking too much of our officers. You said something that was interesting, Don. You said they act as counselors. Mm-hmm. They have 40 hours of training and kind of to be an SRO. If you're a school psychologist, you have 4 to 7 years of training.
Yes.
And so I just think there's a mismatch. It's asking too much of them to be simultaneously a counselor and a law enforcement officer at the same time. And I feel like it puts them in a difficult position. And we see from the data that it's leading to disproportionality in who gets arrested.
Right. So you've characterized police on campuses, as the beginning of this school to prison pipeline. And one thing that I have seen from the statistics, where there are statistics, is that many of the activities, that perhaps when we were in college or in high school, at least when I was in high school, was just bad behavior. Somebody acting up, and that behavior is now if they're arrested, is being criminalized. So do you have some specific examples from your experience in working in the criminal justice system, or working with students in high school, where you can point to, a situation where a student did X, his behavior was criminalized, and the next thing you know, he's in the criminal justice system, or she, and then they're in prison. Can you connect the dots for us there?
Sure, there are certainly those examples. We've had some students throughout this process of introducing this legislation that have shared their stories of interactions with law enforcement that either led to arrest or led to the arrest of friends that they had. I think one thing that's important, though, Don, to remember is that an arrest is certainly a very negative outcome, and it's on the record, and we don't want that to happen. But there's also there's a range of interactions, right, that could lead to everything from just not feeling safe, or having a bad interaction, and getting told to go to the principal's office, and or having a police officer used as a threat, like, if you don't do what you're supposed to do, I'm gonna call Officer X, or so there are other types of interactions that happen. But certainly, yes, we have had students testify to a schoolyard fight, for example, that where several students get arrested, and then some get diversion, some don't, and your point of, I certainly was in been in a fight in school, and it's not, while it's never a good thing, it happens, and I wasn't arrested, thank God, and I think that's something that shouldn't be happening, and certainly not for disruption, not for fighting. There's some things where if a kid brings a gun to school, the police are going to be called no matter what, and that's going to lead to some consequences. But I do think there are many cases where resource officers are getting involved in school discipline, which is also disparate. I think another piece of this is many of these, and the officers cite this rightfully so, many of the arrests are happening at the request of engagement by school staff. And that is a problem too. And again, why proximity matters. I think that's why we need to not have them stationed there, because that would lessen the likelihood for some of these more minor offenses that police actually get called. But yeah, I do think there are certainly examples that we've had from students that have testified of, they got arrested, they got a record, and then it led, unfortunately, to more negative interactions down the line.
Well, you mentioned something interesting a few times here, and that's this proximity issue. And if you look at situations where it's whether it's George Floyd, or whether it's Trayvon Martin, or whether it's the gentleman that I think he got involved in some sort of counterfeit cigarette situation in New York, and
yeah.
the situations I'm trying to describe are situations where police are called for what are you would say either psychological problems or behavioral issues, and so instead of a psychologist or a nurse or someone professional dealing with the situation, you immediately defer to the police, who are not equipped to deal with these kinds of situations. And so immediately what happens is a situation that's simply either bad behavior, or maybe a kid's having a bad day, or they may have schizophrenia or some other psychological problem. And immediately the police are called. So it seems to me that what you're saying is that kind of proximity thing where the police are there and the principals or a teacher immediately defer, to using a police officer rather than looking to some other way to solve the problem.
I think that you put the nail on the head, Don. It is harder to do the things that I'm trying to force us to do, and that many people I think would want to happen. It's harder to have enough psychologists and crisis intervention counselors and social workers present so that we can get children the help that they need holistically, prevent things from happening, and then be able to use restorative justice practices and circles on the back end to, again, not necessarily punish, but make everyone whole in the situation and restore what has been broken, whether it be a fight or a disagreement or the like. And that is much harder, but much more meaningful and important work. Mm-hmm. And I think too often, even if you have officers who are committed to wanting to de-escalate, just their presence is an escalation in and of itself. And I think one of the things why this is a microcosm of the larger discussion we're having in the country about the form and function of law enforcement is that they are involved in too many things that they should not be the primary person involved in, whether it's responding to someone who's experiencing homelessness, whether it's someone who's dealing with a mental health issue or substance abuse issue. There are better, more highly trained people that should be the primary responders on those types of incidences. And I think in the school is a perfect example of there are better people to engage with our kids, other trusted adults, to help mitigate some of these situations.
So you mentioned early on proposing that you were not only proposing legislation to remove police officers from public high school campuses, but you'd also introduce legislation for more funding for other resources, I suppose, to replace those officers and to deal with the issues that are often that police officers on campus are often called on to deal with. So tell us just a little bit more about that specifically. What did you propose with respect to funding, and what kind of new initiatives would you like to see put in place on public high school campuses?
Yes, I appreciate that. We had 3 special appropriations that were introduced along with the legislation to remove the officers. One was $750,000 for restorative justice training for school staff. That is a process that I explained just a second ago about restoring people in the situation who had been harmed. It's less focused on punishment and more on restoration. It has a set of practices, and we do have some training going on with administrators. It hasn't made its way down to teachers and and all of the school staff. So this was to help accelerate that work as an alternative. The other 2 were related to mental health. One was therapeutic recreational services. We often find, particularly in COVID, the ability to kind of in a physical way, talk about what's going on, get out some of that anger and anxiety with trained professionals, and have therapeutic recreation. That can be a really good outlet and helpful, and there's some research behind that. And then the other is after school programming. We know that kids that are productive during the 3 to 6 p.m. hours. A lot of research to show those are critical hours to keeping kids on track. And right now during COVID, kids are signing on online, but this would be, even during COVID, would allow for some in-person, socially distanced resource after school for some of our at-risk students. And so these are just examples. It's by no means going to solve the complete problem. We need to still invest in our nurses, get those ratios. We need a social worker in every high school at a minimum, if not 2. We also need to make sure we're investing in our counselors and get those ratios. Right now, counselors is 1,200 students per 1 counselor. It's just not acceptable ratio. And so that's some other investments that are on the horizon.
Well, in the broader context, we've only touched on it a little bit. Are you hopeful that beginning with your initiative here in schools that will have an impact on the broader social justice issues and the broader criminal justice system, and particularly policing in America. I did a podcast several podcasts ago about policing in America. It was one of our most popular, as you might imagine. Are you hopeful that this initiative that's pretty much focused will have a broader impact?
Absolutely. And I'm engaged in the other broader discussion as well. I introduced and passed with my colleagues a landmark use of force bill that banned the chokeholds and striking restrained individuals and raised the standard of when deadly force can be used from reasonable to necessary. And after other alternatives have been exhausted, required officers to intervene when they see another officer committing a crime or using excessive force. So we've been active in other areas, but I do think this is a specific example of how to change the form and function of policing and have them involved in more only violent crime. I think police right now, we have them responding to too many things. And many police officers will say this as well. They don't want to respond when there's someone homeless. That shouldn't be them. That should be social services. And so there's some things where we agree, but I also don't think they should be stopping people on the street because they smell marijuana and stopping and frisking them and checking to see what's on them. I think we need to change that type of approach. It's a broken windows type of approach to policing. And where you look at something small and go and investigate it, that has not been proven to work well for communities of color in particular. And I just don't think it's an efficient use of resources. We need to focus police on violent crime, and to do that and have other people respond to some of these other issues and make the commensurate investments in health and human services and mental health and student supports and the like, to reflect those changing of priorities and what our police focus on. So I do think it's an example of that, of the larger discussion we're having in the public around the role of public safety and policing.
Well, it leads me to ask, the question, I don't know if you know, but in my early career, I was a state ranger in California, police officer. I trained police officers, was very involved working with police officer standards in training, and had literally thousands of police officers that reported to me. And one of the things I found interesting was working with the police unions. And so I'm wondering to what degree you found success or non-success at working with some of the police unions in attempting to resolve some of these policing problems that facing the nation.
I think that, and I actually didn't know that about you, Don, or I'd forgotten it. And thank you for your service in so many ways. The police unions, I think, in a lot of incidences, unfortunately, have been standing in the way of progress on some of these issues. I'm a big union supporter. I work for Sherrod Brown, and I think unions created the 5-day work week and child labor laws and the like, and fair wages. And I actually think we should pay our police officers more. It's actually one of the things that people are surprised. I think if you want to have high standards and want to make officers that can live in the communities they police and afford to do so and get to know the communities, that we should pay them more. And with that pay should become additional responsibility and accountability. And I think all too often unions, unfortunately, have tried to set up a kind of a separate judicial system for police officers. For example, in the state of Maryland, we have a law that if you're an officer who's been charged with misconduct, you have extra time. You have 5 days before you have to make a statement. Whereas you or I get arrested, we have to make a statement pretty immediately. And so I think these type of extrajudicial due process rights have no place. And also we have really hard time tracking when police officers have misconduct. And as far as their personnel records, we should know, if we're hiring somebody, what their past has been. This is a position of public trust. And unions all too often, and here in the state of Maryland and other places, have stood in the way of reform to those types of initiatives. I would hope that they would work with us on those, But because really what we want is a co-production of public safety. You want those who are being protected and served, or supposed to be protected and served. We decide, they elect representatives to decide what the scope and the shape of that power that we delegate to police to detain, deprive liberty, and in the most extreme instances, take life. That's a very important power that's delegated to keep the society safe. And we should have a check on how and when it's used, and when it's not used appropriately, there should be consequences. And I think all too often unions have gotten in the way of that, and that's unfortunate.
Well, we're going to have to leave it at that, Will. And thank you for your service as well, and the work you're doing on behalf of your constituents there in Montgomery County and on behalf of the nation. I hope it's not another 3 or 4 years before we get a chat again. I know you have to run to your other duties, so thank you very much for joining us on the show today.
Oh, thank you, Don, and happy holidays to your family. And I promise you, it won't be 3 years before we talk again. I promise you that.
All right. Well, the next time I'm in DC, I'll be sure to stop in and say hello. You take care. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you too. Thanks, Don. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the podcast, Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. Happy holidays from our family to yours. We hope that everyone is having a safe and happy holiday season, and that you are all seeing family and friends on Zoom or calling your loved ones wherever they are. It's so good to know that we'll all be able to be together again soon. In the meantime, keep wearing your mask and washing your hands. It keeps you safe and everyone around you. And to all the healthcare workers and essential workers who are out there every day, a lot of you 7 days a week, we see you and we appreciate your sacrifices. Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves, the podcast, will return in 2021 with new stories and guests. If you'd like to share a story on the podcast, go to our website at lifeisastorypodcast.com, where you can submit your information. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast to receive an update on our return in January 2021. From our family to yours, stay safe, share happiness, and remember, the important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.